In the winter of 1912, a trunk was pulled from the bottom of Blackwater Lake. It should have been empty. Instead, it was full of names. Every page inside was written in the same careful hand. Dates, hours, weather, the sound the mother made before the child's first cry. And next to some names, only some, there was a small black mark. No record of those children exists anywhere else. Not in church registries. Not in county birth ledgers. Not in family Bibles. The trunk belonged to a woman named Eliza Wren. For 40 years, she was the midwife of Ashmoor County, a small, church-ruled town tucked deep into the hills of western Pennsylvania. She delivered nearly every child born within 20 miles of the church steeple. She was trusted, respected, invisible. And then, in 1909, she vanished. The official story was simple. She slipped on the lake's edge and drowned. But no body was ever found. 3 years later, her trunk surfaced in winter ice, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. Inside were 27 journals, thousands of births, and margins filled with notes that no one was meant to read. At the center of it all was one family, the Halvorsons. They owned the mills, the church land, the orphanage on the hill, and most of the town's debt. Their name was carved into every cornerstone in Ashmoor County. In Eliza's journals, their name appeared more than any other, not as parents, but as witnesses. And besides certain births, always at night, always in secret, Eliza wrote the same 3 words. They took it. By the time the trunk was opened, the Halvorson estate had already burned to the ground. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, the fire began the same week the trunk was discovered. Someone had been afraid of what Eliza Wren recorded, and someone had tried to erase it. They failed, because once the first page was read, the town of Ashmoor began to remember things it had spent decades trying to forget. And some memories do not stay buried. Eliza Wren arrived in Ashmoor in 1869. No one knew where she came from. She carried no family name, no husband, no history anyone could confirm. She simply arrived by carriage one morning and introduced herself at the church steps, offering her services as a trained midwife. The town needed one. The previous midwife had died in childbirth herself. Reverend Matthew Halvorson approved her immediately. From that day forward, Eliza was present at nearly every birth in Ashmoor County. She walked through snowstorms and summer heat, through farms and factory homes, through wealth and poverty alike. She kept calm hands and sharp eyes. Mothers trusted her more than they trusted doctors. But she did something no one else did. She wrote everything down. Most midwives kept simple notes. Date, mother's name, sex of the child. Eliza wrote pages. She described the air in the room, the silence before labor, the way certain candles flickered when the child crowned. She wrote about dreams mothers confessed to having. She wrote about how some babies did not cry at first. And she wrote about the Halvorsons attending births that were not theirs. It was common for Reverend Halvorson to pray over newborns. That was expected, but Eliza's journals describe something different. They stand too close, she wrote in 1874. They do not look at the mother, only the child. On nights when the Halvorsons arrived unannounced, Eliza marked the page with a faint circle in pencil. There were 67 circles across 40 years. Of those 67 children, only 38 appear later in census records. The rest vanished from documentation entirely. No death certificates, no burial records, no adoption filings, just absence. Eliza never accused anyone directly. She never wrote the word abduction. She never described violence. But her notes became more frantic with time. In 1893 she wrote, "They say it is God's will, but I have heard the crying continue after the carriage door shuts." The church orphanage on Briar Hill expanded that same year, and the Halvorson Mills posted record profits. Briar Hill Orphan Asylum was built in 1888. Officially, it housed children left parentless by mill accidents, illness, or poverty. The church praised the Halvorsons for funding it. A gift to the community, they said. A place of mercy. From the outside, it looked peaceful. White brick, tall windows, a bell tower that rang at sunrise. But Eliza Wren never once recorded delivering an orphan. Every child she delivered had a mother, a name, a home. Yet the orphanage grew steadily each year. In her journals, she began listing names twice. Once under birth, once under absence. Infant male, delivered March 3, 1891. strong lungs. Mother stable. Then, 2 weeks later, house silent. Cradle empty. When Eliza questioned families, answers came rehearsed. They were called to serve elsewhere. God needed them. It was arranged. Arranged by whom? She never wrote. Former orphanage residents later described strict silence rules. No speaking after dusk. No discussing before. Children were renamed upon entry. Birth names were burned in the furnace. And always, Reverend Halvorson visited the nursery wing personally. Eliza wrote in 1901, "I saw one child returned. Not to mother, to the cellar." That line is followed by 5 blank pages. No explanation. No detail. Just emptiness. The cellar of Briar Hill was never listed in official building plans. After the estate fire in 1912, townsfolk entered the abandoned orphanage. The cellar stairs had been sealed with fresh timber. Behind it, they found only ash and a collapsed chamber. No bodies. No records. Only a rusted iron cradle bolted to the floor. The black mark in Eliza's journals appears first in 1883. A small slash beside a newborn girl named Miriam Cole. Healthy. Full term. No complications. The mark was added later. Different ink. Beside it, Eliza wrote, "They have begun selecting." Selecting what? Across the next decades, the black marks increased. Always on children born under certain conditions. Eclipses. Storm nights. Days following church fasts. Eliza recorded patterns. They prefer the third-born. They prefer silence at birth. They prefer those who do not open their eyes. There is no mention of ritual. No mention of harm. Only preference. As if the births were inventory. In 1898, Eliza attempted to refuse entry to the Halvorson carriage during a delivery. Witnesses later recalled shouting. The next Sunday, Reverend Halvorson delivered a sermon on obedience. 2 weeks later, Eliza resumed allowing them inside. But something changed. Her handwriting grew sharper, pressed deeper into the page. In 1906, she wrote, "They believe lineage is a ladder." That same year, the Halvorsons quietly adopted 4 children from Briar Hill. All 4 had black marks in Eliza's journal. All 4 later disappeared from public record before adulthood. Town gossip suggested boarding schools, European travel, illness, but no letters were ever received. No graves were marked. Just silence. Eliza Wren's final entry is dated October 14, 1909. The storm did not come. It waits. She describes being summoned to the Halvorson estate for a private delivery. No mother's name listed. No address beyond the lower room. Her last full paragraph reads, "They say it is the final one. They say the line must close itself." Then the writing trails off mid-sentence. That same night, neighbors reported seeing lanterns moving along Blackwater Lake after midnight. The water was unnaturally calm. By morning, Eliza was gone. Reverend Halvorson announced her tragic accident during Sunday service. He described her as faithful, dedicated, a servant of God. No search party lasted more than a day. The lake gave nothing back. Until winter, when fishermen cut through thick ice and struck wood instead of water. The trunk was sealed with the Halvorson family crest pressed into wax. Inside were journals carefully wrapped to stay dry. Eliza had not drowned with them. She had protected them, which means she knew she would not survive that night. Within days of the journals being read aloud among town elders, the Halvorson estate caught fire. Witnesses claimed the blaze began in the lower room. The same lower room Eliza mentioned in her final entry. Reverend Halvorson and his 2 adopted sons perished in the fire. No remains of a newborn were ever reported. Ashmoor County never rebuilt Briar Hill. The orphanage was left to rot. And over time, births in the town declined sharply. Families moved away. Mill profits collapsed. The Halvorson name faded from stone. But the journals remain. And on the final page of the final book, written faintly in the margin, is a single sentence added long after the ink dried. They believed they were preserving blood. Pause here, because what Eliza uncovered was not about faith. It was about control. And we have only just opened the first 5 books. After the fire of 1912, Ashmoor did something strange. It stopped speaking about the Halvorsons. Not out of grief. Out of calculation. Property deeds were quietly redistributed. Church leadership shifted to distant cousins. The mills were sold under new names. But when census takers returned in 1920, one detail stood out. The Halvorson bloodline had not ended. It had multiplied. 3 households in neighboring counties carried the surname. each claiming distant relation, each wealthy, each with adopted children of unclear origin. Eliza's journals list those same children, black marks beside every one. She had written in 1904, "They do not remove the children to discard them. They remove them to refine them." Refine what? Letters found decades later in a sealed church archive suggest the Halvorsons believed Ashmoor carried diluted covenant blood. They traced their ancestry to a minor Scandinavian clerical dynasty obsessed with genealogical purity. They kept charts, trees, diagrams connecting marriages across counties, marriage within influence, adoption within secrecy, isolation within power. The orphanage was not charity. It was filtration. Eliza's notes began mapping similarities among marked children. Shared eye color, birth order, unusual birthmarks shaped like thin crescents at the base of the neck. She sketched the mark once, not as decoration, as identifier. In 1897 she wrote, "They search for the old sign. They say it reappears every third generation. No medical explanation follows. Only dread." If Eliza had simply accused them of kidnapping, her journals would have been dismissed as hysteria. But she documented patterns with clinical calm. She recorded weight, pulse, symmetry of features. She cross-referenced family names across decades. And beneath her observations was a single growing fear. This was not random cruelty. It was design. Reverend Matthew Halvorson's sermons shifted subtly over the years. Earlier transcripts speak of humility, sacrifice, modest labor. After 1885, language changes. He begins speaking of chosen vessels, of uncorrupted lineage, of the danger of diluted seed. Congregants later recalled how often he referenced Old Testament genealogies, long passages of begots delivered with unusual intensity. He emphasized bloodlines more than belief. Faith became inheritance. And inheritance required protection. Eliza attended services faithfully. Her journals often quote phrases verbatim. In 1892 she wrote, "Today," he said, "the body is the ark of the promise. Some arks must be sealed." That same week, 2 infants with black marks disappeared from records. No funerals were held. No public mourning observed. Ashmoor began accepting absence as divine mystery. That is how institutional control works, not with spectacle, but with repetition. Over time, the idea that certain children were set apart became normal. Mothers were told it was honor, that their child had been chosen for higher purpose. The orphanage bell rang longer on those nights. But no one asked why. In 1903, Eliza attempted something reckless. She copied 3 birth entries and mailed them anonymously to the state registrar in Harrisburg. No reply ever came. 2 months later, Reverend Halvorson preached a sermon titled, "On Betrayal Within." Eliza underlined a single sentence in her journal. "Those who break covenant invite flood." Blackwater Lake flooded that spring for the first time in recorded memory. There is one name Eliza circled twice. Samuel Crow. Born April 11, 1895. Third child. Crescent mark present. /added. Samuel vanished at 3 weeks old. But in 1901, Eliza recorded something impossible. Boy returned. Taller. Eyes vacant. Does not respond to name. Samuel was 6. No record exists of where he had been. His parents claimed the church had provided education, that he had been prepared. Prepared for what? Eliza wrote that his speech had changed, that he recited scripture flawlessly but failed to recognize his mother, that he flinched at candlelight. Most disturbingly, she wrote, "The mark is gone. No scar, no trace, as if it had never existed." Samuel disappeared again at age 12. This time, officially sent to a theological academy out of state. No academy has record of him. Years later, census records list a Samuel M. Halvorson, age consistent, birthplace listed as Ashmoor County. Adopted. That is the first documented instance of a marked child re-entering the Halvorson household not as ward, but as heir. Eliza wrote in 1902, "They are not harvesting children. They are cultivating successors." And suddenly, the orphanage, the sermons, the secrecy, it aligns. This was not about losing children. It was about replacing lineage without appearing to. A bloodline extended through silence. Architectural records of the Halvorson estate show a wine cellar. No lower chamber. Yet in Eliza's final entries, she references the lower room for separate times. Servants later testified, after the fire, that there was indeed a hidden chamber beneath the cellar, accessible through a trapdoor concealed by grain storage. It was windowless, stone-lined, soundproofed by earth. Why would a religious family require such a space? Eliza described the air there as too still. She mentioned a long wooden table, clean instruments, basins of water already prepared before labor began. No mother's name is listed in that final entry, which suggests something else. Possibly someone already living within the estate. Possibly someone not meant to be known. She wrote, "They say the line must close itself. Close itself, not end. Complete." If their belief in generational signs was genuine, then perhaps they thought they had finally found the child who fulfilled their pattern. The final vessel. The perfected heir. And if Eliza resisted, if she threatened to document what occurred, then the lake becomes less an accident and more a decision. After 1912, Ashmoor entered what historians now call a quiet collapse. Birth rates dropped. Church attendance declined. The orphanage shuttered permanently. No formal investigation into Eliza's disappearance was reopened, because reopening it would require acknowledging the journals. And acknowledging the journals would require admitting the town knew. Collective silence is not ignorance. It is survival. Families who once surrendered children convinced themselves it had been righteous, necessary, sacred. Admitting otherwise would mean accepting complicity, so they forgot, or tried to. But patterns leave residue. By the 1930s, neighboring counties reported an unusual cluster of wealthy families with adopted heirs of unknown origin. Shared features, similar ages, educated privately, married strategically. No public scandal ever formed. No criminal charges filed. But genealogists studying regional records decades later found something unsettling. The crescent birthmark appears again in the 1940 census, under a different surname, in a different state. Eliza's final margin note returns like an echo. They believe they were preserving blood, not destroying, preserving. The question is not whether children vanished. The records prove they did. The question is what those children were shaped into, and whether the line truly ended with the fire, or simply learned to move quietly. We have reached the midpoint, and the deeper truth lies not in what was taken, but in what was made. When historians finally studied Eliza's journals in full during the 1940s, one detail stood out that no one in Ashmoor had noticed. The marked children shared similar middle names: Grace, Solomon, Miriam, Elias, Ruth, Matthias. Biblical, yes, but more specifically, names that appear in passages about covenant and inheritance. Eliza began underlining middle names in 1899. By 1905, she had created a separate index in the back of Journal 15 titled Sequence, not a list of births, a list of alignments. She arranged names chronologically, then cross-checked them against scripture passages the Reverend frequently preached from that same year. The alignment was almost ritualistic. When he preached on the binding of Isaac, a marked male child was taken within a week. When he preached on purification of bloodlines, twin girls with the crescent mark disappeared from census tracking the following year. Coincidence weakens when repetition strengthens. Eliza wrote, "He announces the choosing before the choosing occurs." This suggests foreknowledge. Selection before birth. Meaning someone was tracking pregnancies long before labor began. Meaning someone had access to private confessions. The church confessionals. Ashmoor families confessed everything to the Halvorsons. Health, lineage doubts, family illnesses, blood disorders. They handed over genealogical information willingly, believing it sacred. But what if it was cataloged? What if Eliza was not the only one keeping books? In 1913, after the estate fire, a partially burned ledger was discovered beneath collapsed beams. Most pages were ash. One page survived enough to read 3 words. Third-born male, viable. That handwriting did not match Eliza's. It matched Reverend Halvorson's sermons. The pattern in the names was not spiritual. It was procedural. In 1887, a physician named Dr. Nathaniel Barlow began visiting Ashmoor twice a year. Officially, he inspected mill workers for lung disease. Unofficially, his visits coincided almost perfectly with Eliza's black-marked births. Barlow was trained in early genetic theory, a controversial field at the time. He lectured in Philadelphia about hereditary strength and degeneracy. Most of his work is lost, but archived letters reveal a fascination with isolated populations maintaining desirable traits. Ashmoor was isolated, tightly controlled, genealogically mapped. Eliza mentioned Barlow only twice by name, both times after a marked child was taken. In 1894 she wrote, "Doctor observed infant before baptism. Measured skull. Said nothing to mother. Measured skull. That was not standard medical care." In 1900 she wrote, "They speak in numbers when I am present. Ratios. Percentages. They believe I do not understand." But Eliza understood enough to fear it. Eugenics was gaining quiet traction in certain academic circles by the turn of the century. The idea that bloodlines could be refined through selective breeding was not yet widely condemned. In Ashmoor, under religious cover, such ideas could operate without scrutiny. If the Halvorsons believed they carried a rare lineage, if Barlow believed it could be strengthened, then Briar Hill becomes less a shelter and more a laboratory disguised as mercy. Barlow's medical license was quietly revoked in 1915. Reason listed, unethical research practices. No details provided. He died childless in 1922, or so records claim. Eliza was not alone in her suspicions. She simply wrote them down. In 1891, 3 mothers approached her separately after losing marked children. Each described similar experiences. The church carriage arrived at night. They were told their child required special blessing. They were asked to sign documents they could not read fully. They were promised visitation. None were granted. One mother, Clara Whitmore, attempted to confront Reverend Halvorson publicly after Sunday service. By winter, Clara and her husband had relocated to seek work. They never appeared in census again. Eliza wrote, "Fear spreads quietly. It does not shout." Women began avoiding confession during pregnancy. Some delivered in secret barns, hoping to avoid notice. But secrecy invites suspicion. The Halvorsons controlled the mills. Employment could disappear overnight. Debt could be called in without warning. Control did not require force. It required leverage. By 1907, Eliza's journal tone shifts from observation to urgency. They are running out of patience. They need the final alignment. Final alignment of what? Blood. Generation. Completion of some internal prophecy. When Eliza refused entry to the estate that last October, perhaps she was not resisting a single birth, but the culmination of decades. And perhaps the women of Ashmoor knew more than history credits them for. Silence does not always mean ignorance. Sometimes it means calculation. The estate fire burned unnaturally hot. Stone cracked. Metal warped. Witnesses described flames that did not spread outward, but downward, as if something below ground was the true fuel. When investigators sifted through debris, they noted the absence of ordinary household remains. Few personal effects. No detailed financial ledgers. No family correspondence older than 5 years. It was as if the past had been curated. Only certain artifacts remained. The crest seal, fragments of genealogical charts, and a melted silver locket containing a small scrap of parchment. The parchment bore a single drawn symbol, a crescent, identical to Eliza's sketch. The official cause of fire was listed as oil lamp malfunction. Case closed within weeks. But townspeople whispered that screams were heard long after flames consumed the upper floors. Screams from below. No cellar chamber was documented in the fire report, which suggests investigators never found it, or chose not to. After the fire, remaining Halvorson relatives left Ashmoor quickly. Property sold at undervalued prices. Church leadership transferred to an external diocese. The structure of power dissolved, but not the network. Because power rarely vanishes. It relocates. And if the purpose had truly been preservation of blood, then the work would not end with a single house. It would adapt. By the 1930s, several prominent families in 3 different states displayed peculiar similarities. Adopted heirs, unusual privacy, limited public photographs before age 10, shared educational institutions, marriage alliances within a small circle. A genealogist in 1948 noticed something unsettling while tracing land inheritance lines. Many of these heirs had no verifiable birth certificates, only amended records issued years later. Eliza's journals listed their original birth dates. Cross-referenced quietly, the alignment was precise. Marked children, relocated, reintroduced under new names. But the crescent birthmark rarely reappeared in adulthood records, which suggests either removal or misidentification at birth, or perhaps something simpler. The mark faded naturally with age. The symbol may not have been mystical at all, just a harmless congenital variation imbued with meaning by obsession. That possibility makes the story darker, because it means nothing supernatural drove the selection. Only belief. Belief powerful enough to justify removal, powerful enough to convince a town, powerful enough to silence mothers, and powerful enough to cost Eliza Wren her life. By 1950, Ashmoor was half its former size. The mills shut down. Briar Hill collapsed inward. Blackwater Lake remains calm most winters. But local fishermen still say that when the ice cracks at dusk, the sound echoes like distant crying. No bodies were ever recovered. No formal charges ever filed. But the journals survived. And they tell us something chilling. Institutions do not need monsters to commit harm. They need conviction. And enough silence to let it grow. In 1949, a young archivist named Daniel Hargrove began digitizing county records from western Pennsylvania. He was not looking for Ashmoor. He was tracking land transfers tied to abandoned mill towns. But patterns have a way of finding the patient eye. Hargrove noticed something strange. Several properties originally owned by the Halvorson estate had been sold at a loss after the fire. Yet within 5 years, adjacent land parcels in neighboring counties were quietly purchased by unrelated families with no prior wealth. When he traced those families backward, the line led through amended birth certificates, adopted heirs, new surnames, identical legal firms processing documentation. He overlaid a simple map, Ashmoor at the center, radiating outward, small clusters of influence, each one containing a family whose adopted child matched a birth listed with a black mark in Eliza Wren's journals. The pattern resembled spokes from a wheel, not escape, expansion. In his private notes, Hargrove wrote, "This is not diaspora. This is transplantation." The language chilled even him. Because transplantation implies intention. He attempted to publish a paper in 1952 suggesting coordinated adoption irregularities tied to pre-war religious networks. The paper was rejected as speculative. No mention of Ashmoor made it into print. Hargrove abandoned the project shortly after receiving a letter advising him to focus on material of public value. He kept the map. It was discovered after his death in 1978, folded inside a copy of Eliza's 15th journal. Pinned at the center of the map was a small hand-drawn crescent. By mid-century, Ashmoor's story faded into local folklore. Children were told not to swim in Blackwater Lake. Not because of drowning, because the water keeps what it's given. The orphanage ruins became a dare for teenagers. They spoke of cold drafts rising from beneath collapsed floorboards, of hearing faint bell chimes at dusk though the tower had long fallen. No documented hauntings, no ghosts, just atmosphere heavy with omission. The Halvorson name occasionally resurfaced in business registries across state lines, always connected to philanthropic foundations focused on heritage preservation and family continuity initiatives. Never directly traceable, never scandalous, just persistent. In 1963, a small-town newspaper in Ohio ran a human interest piece about a wealthy young couple expecting their third son. The article praised their long-standing ancestral mark, a crescent-shaped birthmark that appears every few generations. The photo was grainy, but visible, a faint crescent at the base of the newborn's neck. No one connected it publicly to Ashmoor, but Hargrove clipped the article and placed it beside his map. Myth becomes memory when evidence aligns. Memory becomes warning when no one listens. The tragedy of Eliza Wren is not that she uncovered evil. It is that she recognized something more ordinary. Obsession wrapped in righteousness. The Halvorsons likely believed they were guardians of something sacred, that preserving their interpretation of lineage justified intervention, that removing children was elevation, not theft. History is full of such thinking. It rarely announces itself as cruelty. It calls itself duty. Eliza never wrote the word monster. She wrote belief again and again. They believe. They truly believe. That repetition is important, because systems built on belief are harder to dismantle than systems built on greed. Greed can be exposed. Belief defends itself. In her final months, Eliza stopped trying to convince others. She focused on documentation. She wrapped her journals in oilcloth. She sealed them with wax. She placed them in a trunk and sank them in a lake that froze each winter, ensuring preservation. She did not try to stop the final birth. She tried to leave a record. And that may have been the only resistance possible. We return now to October 14th, 1909. The line must close itself. What did that mean? If the Halvorsons were engineering continuity through selective adoption and controlled marriages, then closing the line may not have meant ending it. It may have meant stabilizing it, achieving the desired traits without further selection. A final heir born within the estate itself, carrying both cultivated lineage and original blood. If that child survived the fire, if that child was removed before flames reached the lower room, then the bloodline would not need orphanages or night carriages anymore. It would continue naturally, quietly, respectably. That possibility is impossible to prove. No infant remains were reported in the estate ruins. No record of a newborn death that week exists. Which leaves us with absence. An absence, when repeated often enough, becomes its own evidence. Ashmoor today is barely a town. The church was rebuilt in simpler form. Briar Hill is overgrown. Blackwater Lake reflects sky without disturbance. But genealogists studying certain American family lines still encounter irregular gaps around the turn of the century. Amended certificates, delayed registrations, adoptions sealed by religious authority. Nothing illegal on paper, nothing dramatic, just quiet rearrangements. Eliza Wren's journals are now archived under restricted access. Scholars debate whether the events represent localized religious extremism, early eugenics experimentation, or simple paranoia amplified by isolation. Perhaps it was all three. What remains undeniable is this. Children disappeared. Records were altered. Power concentrated around lineage. And a midwife risked everything to write it down. No supernatural curse hangs over Ashmoor. No confirmed ritual ever exposed. Only a lesson older than the town itself. When institutions convince themselves that blood determines destiny, they will reshape the world to match that belief. Even if it means reshaping children. Even if it means silencing witnesses. Even if it means fire. Somewhere in America, a crescent birthmark still appears every few generations. Most who carry it never know Ashmoor existed. They live ordinary lives. They inherit wealth, influence, education. They believe their family history begins exactly where records say it does. But history does not begin where records begin. Sometimes it begins in a locked trunk beneath a frozen lake, with a woman who refused to forget. And that is where we close the file.